I'm Garrett Clark. I'm a visiting research fellow at the School of Medicine at Adelaide University, and I research paleoanthropology, which is human evolution, and specifically brain evolution, with an emphasis on psychedelic neuroscience.
Gary, welcome to In Psychedelia.
Thank you.
I first saw your talk, only part of it, unfortunately, because EGA was very busy, but at the 2017 Psychedelic Symposium, the Entheogenesis Australis Psychedelic Symposium, and your talk there was the Dionysian Primate, the default mode network, psychopathology, and the psychedelic brain. And there's a few big words in there, but maybe let's start with the first one. Dionysian, why have you chosen Greek god as your first way to describe what you're talking about here?
Well, that choice was based on the idea that humans are a quite unusual primate, and when I look at ritual behaviour, for example, and the use of psychedelic compounds throughout human history, both you find it in the anthropological literature and in the archaeological record. I look at humans basically as another mammal, as another primate. And what's very, very unusual about humans is that we engage in these ritual practices for social bonding and usually to alter consciousness. So the idea of a Dionysian primate refers to the Dionysian rituals of ancient Greece, but it tries to express a more broader issue that humans are very, very unique in that we engage in these very unique kinds of social behaviours, which we call ritual.
Let's crack something on the head quickly here, because probably a lot of people have heard of the Greek god Dionysus or Dionysus, but they might associate this god with the god of wine and of drunkenness, because this is something that we commonly see. But from what we understand of the sorts of things that were called wine or have been referred to as wine in ancient Greece, it's not necessarily something that contains alcohol or solely contains alcohol. And then if we also go to things like, maybe you could touch on the Eleusinian mysteries and the sorts of broader range of altered states that were being accessed in ancient Greece.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's evidence that possibly ergot was used, which is a naturally occurring kind of fungi, I think it is, quite small fungi related to LSD, that possibly was infused into the wine, so that the wine was possibly a psychedelic wine. And in the Birth of Tragedy, where Nietzsche talks about the Dionysian rituals, he kind of implies that it was a narcotic that was more than just wine. So I think we've kind of inherited a tradition where we think of it as a kind of alcoholic beverage, because in the West we seem to be quite into alcohol. But I think there's evidence that possibly even those rituals were using psychoactive compounds. The book by Wasson, I think, The Road to Eleusis, argues that case quite persuasively, I think.
And we're going to put alcohol to the side now because we're not as interested in that. In your talk, you're also talking about the default mode network. Maybe you could explain what the default mode network is, and talk to us a little bit about what psychedelic substances do to this default mode network.
Yeah, the default mode network, it's a uniquely human aspect of our cognition. It's a kind of neural hub, if you like, of different brain regions that operate together. And the default mode network is it's what they call task negative network. So it's the part of your consciousness that is active when you're not engaged in a task. You're not fixing your car or whatever. You're sort of just daydreaming. So it's sort of when you consciously ruminate upon the conditions of your existence, I suppose. And it's very important, but it's kind of a double-edged sword in that it can cause us a lot of problems. For example, the default mode network is involved in our ability to project ourselves into the future and imagine future scenarios, which helps us plan our lives, and would, for very ancient humans, would have helped them plan hunting expeditions and the making of weapons and things like that. And you can also imagine events from the past, so you can reflect on what's happened in the past. And it also is involved in theory of mind, which is the ability for us to have thoughts about thoughts. So we can have thoughts about the thoughts that someone else has about someone else and the thoughts that they have about us personally. So it's this kind of metacognitive capacity that we have, but it can sort of become overheated, if you like, and cause us problems. You can ruminate upon things too much, and overactivity of the default mode network has been implicated in psychopathology and depression when people are really kind of internally ruminating on their lives, and it can cause them a lot of stress. In terms of psychedelics, the default mode network is thought to be associated with the ego complex that we kind of get from depth psychology, coming from Freud and into Jung. And psychedelics have been shown to basically reduce activity in the default mode network and stop this kind of constant internal rumination that causes people so much stress. And it's by altering activity in the default mode network, it's been found, psychedelics have been found to produce quite significant therapeutic outcomes.
So we can sort of think of the default mode network as your sort of waking consciousness as you're going about your day. If you're generally engaged in something, this is your default mode network at play. You're thinking about the task in front of you. You might be thinking about what's for dinner, what I'm going to have for lunch later, what the next piece of work that I have to do is, this sort of thing. So we're all quite familiar with this. And as you said, it can go haywire, and I'm sure many people are familiar with the experience of anxiety, which seems to be a staple of Western culture right now, and this constant thinking about what's going to happen in the future, and this looming feeling of something bad being around the corner. So we know psychedelics affect this. Now, there's a bit of on the online discussions around some of the neuroscientific research that's been coming out of US, UK, and a few other places in Europe. Sort of, it shows that there seems to be, there's a change in the way that the default mode network works, and some people interpret that as a drop of activity, and some people are interpreting that as this not quite a rise in activity, but a change in the interactions. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on here? Are we losing activity? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's been two kind of research teams, and they're getting conflicting results, and they're trying to resolve them. But in terms of I suppose the way to, or an interesting way to think about it is reduced activity in the default mode network. So the default mode network is segregated off from other brain regions. So you might have deeper subcortical and emotional brain regions. And the default mode network is kind of segregated off from them, and it kind of operates in its own kind of segregated neural hub. Now, what psychedelics do is they increase what is called global connectivity. So instead of the default mode network kind of operating on its own, if you like, it starts to communicate with other brain regions. So you start to get increases in global connectivity, where, for example, connections between the default mode network, this kind of higher executive function, connections between that and, say, the visual cortex and deeper subcortical brain regions, such as the parahippocampus, and these brain regions that seem to be associated with altered states of consciousness. The default mode network starts communicating with those regions a great deal more, and we think that's possibly what produces the therapeutic outcomes, because there's increases in a kind of greater integration between the different subsystems in the brain, if you like. So that's possibly how reduced activity in that region may result in greater global activity in the brain as a whole.
So we know probably many people are familiar with some of the traditional psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, or magic mushrooms, and mescaline, and might have had some experience or seen friends that have had experience, but they might not have seen necessarily beneficial things, or they might have just seen or heard weird things, these sort of odd sensory blurring experiences. Obviously, with the therapeutic research that's going on, this is using these as specific tools in specific settings with specific protocol to follow to achieve specific outcomes. But with these odd things that are going on, I mean, we haven't had these sort of protocols in humanity for very long. In fact, we still are building them now, but we know that psychedelic substances have been taken for probably thousands of years. What role did they play in culture? What were they? How were people utilizing them to gain some benefit or some insight or whatever it is that they were looking for?
Yeah, I think that the important thing to consider is the ritual context, the reverence with which they were held as a kind of sacrament. And I think there's a sense that the visual hallucinations that you experience in psychedelics is almost like you're moving in to the psychedelic state, and it's as you go further in and deeper into the psychedelic state, to the acute state, then you may experience a kind of peak mystical state, this kind of boundary dissolving experience. So in some sense, the visual hallucinations that we associate with them in Western culture may not really be the most important aspect of them in terms of their use in traditional cultures and more ancient human cultures, going back possibly 7,000 years. Some of the evidence in the archaeological record suggests their use in Africa going back 7,000 years. So I would say that it's in another sense, I think that traditional peoples often talk about psychedelics as teachers, that the plants are teachers, and it's almost not the actual acute psychedelic state, this boundary dissolving state of kind of or peak mystical experience. That's important, but it's almost the kind of educational trajectory that you kind of enter once you've had an experience like that, and how the psyche can become more integrated and whole, if you like, over a period of time as a result of continued use of psychedelics within a religious and sacred context.
Perhaps a way to put it in terms that somebody might understand if they haven't tried a psychedelic before is if you're watching a movie that has this incredible story, but you're paying all of the attention to this amazing CGI that they've put all through it. I mean, you can get a lot out of that. It's beautiful, especially. Yeah. I really enjoy some of the. I mean, I can enjoy a movie that's almost purely CGI with very little story. But the sort of point of the matter is that if you've got this impressive story underlying it, and you're paying attention to all the whizzes and bangs, then you kind of maybe missing something. And although those are impressive too, the story that underlies it is perhaps the more important thing.
Yeah, and also the visual imagery can often be quite emotionally potent as well. You may have or see images before you of past traumatic events and things like that, which can be quite cathartic, and you can kind of after the session you can work through them with with a therapist or something, or a counsellor, and you know, deal with. I suppose the way of another way of looking at it is, if you think of depth psychology, and for example, Jung was very interested in people accessing the deep unconscious layers of their mind through analysis of dreams, and the dreams were kind of thought to be kind of this other life, or expressive of this other life that's buried beneath our ego consciousness, but that was a kind of quite laborious and involved project to try and resurrect this deeper aspect of the psyche through analysis of dreams. Thinking of the psychedelic state, it's useful to think of it as possibly bringing that unconscious material to the surface while you are awake, and so the unconscious is kind of there for you to see and you experience in all its intensity, and sometimes in great beauty, or it can also be terrifying. So the parallel with dreams is probably a good one, I think.
This is in Psychedelia on 3CR, 855 AM, 3CR Digital and 3cr.org.au. Speaking now with Dr. Gary Clark from University of Adelaide, who recently was at the 2017 Psychedelic Symposium, Entheogenesis Australis Psychedelic Symposium. If you want to check out some videos of some other talks, youtube.com/EntheoTV, and there will be some of the talks from the 2017 Psychedelic Symposium up over the next few months. And Gary was talking about the Dionysian Primate, the default mode network, psychopathology, and the psychedelic brain. And we've just been talking about metaphors for this state, and dreams. I think, yeah, it is a very good metaphor, especially for those that really get into exploring them. I think a lot of us probably do, but I know that some people that I speak to just claim to not have any dreams. I'm not sure I believe them, but some people just claim to not have any dreams. Now, it's, I suppose, with these states, what can we do knowing this knowledge? What can we do with them knowing what we're talking about here?
Well, I suppose from my point of view, it's when you think of depth psychology, for example, and Jungian depth psychology, which looked at, you know, how the unconscious or collective unconscious, if you like, is expressed in various mythological and religious systems. In terms of trying to understand those aspects of the psyche from a scientific or an empirical point of view, it's been very, very difficult to establish the kind of establish a means by which we can study the deeper unconscious layers of the psyche scientifically. Now, the work that's been done at Imperial College by Robin Carhart-Harris, he's proposing that psychedelics actually enable scientists and neuroscientists to actually study the deeper unconscious layers of the psyche empirically and scientifically. So they can give people some psychedelic compounds and then have them go under an fMRI and look at changes in brain activity, and then collect the subjective reports that people, or collect reports from the people of their subjective experience, and correlate those with changes in brain activity. And when they report, for example, these peak mystical experiences or ego dissolving experiences, or the kind of welling up of past trauma and things like that, they can correlate these deeper levels of experience with changes in neural activity within the brain, and actually see what's happening and get a grasp on what's happening empirically, and then other people can replicate these experiments. So it's a very, very powerful research tool in that it enables us to study aspects of the human psyche that have probably been very, very difficult for science to kind of get a handle on and some kind of traction with. So from a purely scientific point of view, I think their use in neuroscientific research is very important, and probably represents a quite significant paradigm shift in our understanding of the brain, and not only our more advanced cognitive functions, but the deeper and more ancient layers of the human psyche that have evolved over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years.
I don't expect you to have an answer for this one, but do animals have psychedelic experience, or can an animal have a psychedelic experience? And the reason why I ask this, I suppose, is what's the significance of this research and understanding this about the human brain when compared to other animals? Are we seeing something that really sets us apart, or is there a conundrum, a quandary in here that we can't quite unlock because of the nature of these sorts of questions?
That's not something I'm particularly familiar with in terms of other animals having psychedelic experiences. I know that other animals do take drugs or what we would call medicinal plants. Chimpanzees have plants which they eat for various ailments and things like that. And I know a lot of animals do eat plants that have medicinal benefits. But I think they have done experiments and they've found that other animals will take amphetamines and cocaine or alcohol, but they have a disinclination to take LSD, I think. But looking at the comparison between humans and chimpanzees, I suppose I'd emphasise it's not so much that other animals like or dislike psychedelics, it's the fact that humans actually do take them. And what is it that's unique about the human brain that drives humans to use them? There's, going back to the default mode network, the interesting thing about the default mode network is it only reaches full maturation during adolescence. So this kind of more advanced cognitive capacity that we have as adults, it doesn't kind of come online until the adolescent period of growth. So the adolescent and the adult form of the default mode network is quite different and distinct from the infant and the childlike form of the default mode network. So there's a very, very important period of socio-cognitive development during adolescence that humans go through. Now, the important thing to note is that chimpanzees and other primates don't have this adolescent period of growth, and they don't have this default mode network like humans do. And humans mature very slowly, so we have extended periods of brain development extended periods of socialization for acquiring language and all of the skills we need to be a member of our social group. And so we don't reach kind of sexual maturity until our mid to late teens, whereas chimpanzees start reproducing around 8-9 years of old. And we presume some of our more ancient ancestors would have reproduced around the time of chimpanzees, going back 3-4 million years, the Australopithecines, for example. So the point I'd make is that it's the default mode network, this kind of top-heavy cognition, that causes us a lot of problems, and it's probably a kind of part of our brain that's dissociated from more ancient layers of the brain, if you like, more archaic layers of the brain. The fact that psychedelics target this network, psychedelics may be a kind of ritual technology that humans have devised to kind of placate this more kind of weighty and burdensome inner life that we have, as a kind of therapeutic tool used in ritual contexts. So I would tend to emphasize the reason that humans are cognitively different from other species, and therefore we kind of use psychedelics to deal with that as a kind of very ancient ritual technology, if you like.
Gary, we're nearly out of time, but before we finish up, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment? Are you working on more about this? Is there something at the moment, some research that you're keeping your eye on, or a book that you really want to read to sort of broaden the scope on this? What's on your mind at the moment?
At the moment, I'm sort of expanding on the stuff that I just spoke about the adolescent period of growth, and there's also interesting work on looking at serotonin receptors within the human brain and the role of serotonin in the evolution of our species. and psychedelics target serotonin receptors. So the serotonin or the serotonergic system in humans may be quite important. Serotonin is very important. It's involved in various aspects of empathy, in human morality, social bonding, and it's also when there's deficits in the serotonergic system, that's often involved with psychopathology. So looking at the importance of the serotonergic system in human evolution and evolution of the human brain, and how psychedelics may have been taken up as a very, very ancient means of altering the serotonin system and establishing greater levels of social cohesion and social bonding within archaic human communities through ritual practices. So trying to bring the neurochemistry together with the kind of evolutionary biology and the anthropology and what we know from the ethnographic record.
And for anyone that's sitting wherever they happen to be listening to their radio right now and thinking, I want to keep up to date with your work, is there somewhere online that they can keep up to date with it or read your papers or anything like that?
I have an academia edu page and on ResearchGate. I have a number of my articles up there, and I'll be putting more up there when I publish more on psychedelics. Yeah. Excellent.
We'll post a link to that on the In Psychedelia Facebook and Twitter so that you can check out some of those. I think academia.edu is free to sign up, and then you can follow people. It's sort of like a social network for academic paper sharing, for anyone that's not familiar with it. Thank you very much for coming on to the show today, Gary Clark, and very interested to hear about your future research. So we'll stay in touch.
No worries. Thanks, Nick.